Hey everybody, we're getting close to the end. We got one of our last lectures today, and at the end of this week, we're going to be taking our final quiz. And at this point, we should be done with our assignments. After this week, we'll be done with our quizzes, and we're really just looking at preparing for our final exam and final essay. Final exam is going to cover everything we cover in our lectures for the rest of the semester, so make sure you're still keeping up with the lectures, looking at the what do we learn slides, and making sure that you understand the new content as well as the old. Use your quizzes as review guides. Those questions, hint, hint, very likely will be on the final. So make sure you have studied my feedback on your quizzes, and we make sure we're prepared for our upcoming finals. This quiz will be pretty quick, pretty short. It's just last week's lecture and this week's lecture. So a lot of this week's lecture also is going to be a review for what we've covered in the class, but through a specific lens, your ability to interact with your government. So we're going to cover a lot of review content, a couple new points, but we're going to make sure that we understand everything covered in our what do we learn slides for our quiz due at the end of the week. All right, intermediaries between the people and the state. So one fascinating thing about this lecture is, for one, it's going to be a significant review, but additionally, I'm going to be able to have the opportunity to dive into some of what I researched as a graduate student when I was studying at the University of Montana. Some stuff that I really find fascinating, and really it's the structure that guides our lives. That's the whole reason I found political science fascinating, because it's studying why we are the way we are. Why do at large, the question I always said when I summarized why I'm doing my thesis was, why do we hate each other so much? Why do Democrats and Republicans have this degree of division when in reality you could talk about policies separate of partisanship and have a lot of compromise? So this is what I discovered as a very brief part of this lecture is what I discovered while researching these concepts. A lot of these are objective truths that I found through other researchers' work and built upon in my own. So let's dive into this along with a good amount of review. All right, so when we talk about public opinion, there are some key aspects that I want to review with you. We see the importance of framing, and that is the context in which you place a polling question, a report, what your policy position. It's the way you fit a policy position, a context, to incite various prejudices, preconceived conceptions about life and beliefs. You see that you also see some very important terms that I have mentioned and yelled at you in your papers. Absolutely, empirical and normative. Empirical, we want to remember that these are statements that are based on assessments of data. This is factually driven information and claims. You cannot make a claim that is empirical without having a supporting data point that has been proven through research. Now, a normative claim is me saying this is a good lecture. It's establishing some kind of value judgment that comes from me as a writer or as the source. So normative claims, value judgments or evaluations that place your belief of how good something is within the expression of what it is. And it is important within the context of political science courses to have empirical framing at all times, but also be able to identify normative claims, normative framing, frames that incite your preconceived conceptions about what may be better or worse that rely on your value judgments or the value judgments of the source of the content. Now, when we talk about the issues we talk about within these environments, it's important to remember something we covered in the last lecture: spatial and valence issues. Remember, spatial issues are issues that have a wide range of policy positions. Minimum wage, you could want $7.25 and make me really sad like I was as a high school student back in Virginia, or you can make it $15 and make people in California and Washington quite happy with their minimum wage. So spatial issues that provide a wide range of policy positions among a single spectrum that any single individual, state, collective can identify with. Valence issues, we all want our representatives to be more honest. We all want a more lucrative economy. We all want a higher GDP. These are issues where there is a consistent preference of a higher value. So public opinion is very important to be able to not just examine, but understand fully. Understand when you're looking at normative claims, empirical claims. Understand when an issue allows for spatial difference and you can have a different perspective than others while still agreeing on a general overarching claim. Valence issues, simply something that can unite all of us. We all want a better economy. We all want more honest and responsive representatives. So public opinion, very important, overarching. It's a way to see some of these important terms that we've covered throughout the class, but in one specific frame. Takeaway from this slide, remember the definition of empirical, normative, and remember the difference between spatial and valence issues. So this is a slight review of the role of state and local governments. A lot of times you'll see when you have to intervene and engage with your government, the first step to doing so is on a local level. So why is it that we have to start at the local level and work our way up to have political engagement in a productive manner? Well, for one, when we look at new changes within electoral systems or within government, we see that the states can actually act as laboratories of change. These are avenues in which you can implement a single policy position to see if it is productive within a single state and later can be implemented on the federal level. This was the intention of a lot of our founding fathers, to provide this nuance within state governments to allow for diversity and allow for testing of ideologies, ideas, and systems of government. So we see that underlying this idea of laboratories of change within state governments, we see the supremacy clause. And this does state that any law addressed within the federal level will trump the state laws. Federal authority shall be the law of the land, as our Constitution states within the supremacy clause. This is basically saying if our federal government has anything addressing this issue within our Constitution or statutory law, the law written by Congress, it must be enacted within the state level. But if there is any nuance within this legislation, the states have the capacity to act as a laboratory for change and test different avenues of policy initiatives. Now, we don't just have our supremacy clause that states this. We have the 9th and 10th Amendments, which the 9th Amendment states directly that you cannot, that the federal law will trump state law, but anything not addressed within the federal Constitution or federal statutory law will be left up to the states and the people. Now, the 10th Amendment addresses that you cannot implement amendments or changes to the Constitution that override existing individual liberties provided within previous amendments. But it's often used in coordination with the 9th Amendment to focus on the role of states in relation to any legislation not addressed by the federal government. That legislation, and this is important for your quiz, is left up to the states and the people. Now, we talked about that 10th Amendment and how you can't have specific policy initiatives that override previous rights provided within the Bill of Rights. Well, we can also look at selective incorporation, and we want to review this and make sure we understand this process quite well because it stems from the Equal Protection Clause within the 14th Amendment, and it is the process in which we took our Bill of Rights and we applied it to restrict the state governments as well as the federal governments. Now, although the states have the ability to address any issue not directly addressed by the federal government, they also must ensure that they maintain the implementation of the Bill of Rights and the amendments within it. So originally in Barron v. Baltimore in the 1800s, we saw that the Bill of Rights only applied to restricting the federal governments because there are protections for state rights in relation to federal intervention. But after the 14th Amendment was implemented during the Reconstruction era with the other two amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, the 14th Amendment made sure through Equal Protection Clause that selective incorporation began, a case-by-case process in which we made the Bill of Rights also restrict federal governments in order to protect your individual liberties, an action that was not present prior. So now, we understand that generally. I won't dive into the specific amendments. If you have questions, I will happily have a discussion about the amendments, the specific amendments via email, via Zoom, whatever you please. But I don't want to waste too much time examining that in detail. So it is clear, this is a lot of review here, it is exclusively a review here, the relationship between our state and federal governments. States can act as laboratories of change. The Supremacy Clause states that if the federal government addresses something within its statutory code or constitution, it must also apply to the state. But the 9th Amendment states that if it is not addressed within our constitution or statutory law, it is left to the state and the people. And additionally, we see that selective incorporation requires that states align with the Bill of Rights as well as the federal government. States are also restricted in today's government. So let's talk about an issue that covers the relationship between state and federal governments, and that content is the concept of nationalization. Now, this may be a little confusing, but there are two definitions of nationalization here. One, nationalization at large, the transition that brings privately owned industries and companies under public authority. When you talk about international relations, this is something you will see quite frequently. You look at the nationalization of various industries by the federal governments. You look at nations abroad, you see the nationalization of oil industries quite frequently and various other industries of that nature. Now, we have a current push for our government to do this regarding healthcare. So we nationalize the healthcare industry so it does not require as much, does not maintain as much for-profit motives. But also we have to understand a different definition of nationalization, one that I relied on in my thesis as a graduate student. This is the social definition of nationalization, the transition from a locally oriented presence to a nationally oriented presence. It aligns with the word nationalization. Think of your preference to read local newspapers, your grandparents' preference to read local newspapers, and now your preference to obtain news through national online sources like social media, like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever it may be, those national sources that focus primarily on national policy issues, not local issues. We are not that embedded within Kalispell local politics as we are in American national politics. That is the process of nationalization that in my research I identified as increasing significantly in the last handful of decades since the 80s. So we see two definitions for nationalization. Nationalization regarding industry, in which you transition a privately owned industry and you make it publicly owned. Companies put it under public authority, nationalized, owned by the state, and maintain less for-profit motives. And this is done through healthcare currently within the US. Well, there is a push for it to be done through healthcare within the United States, while this is already in effect in the vast majority of Western democracies in Europe. We also remember nationalization on the social context, the transition from a locally oriented presence to a nationally oriented presence. You stop reading your local, the Flathead Beacon, and you start reading the New York Times. There's actually a study that is present within Eagle Online. Lisa George and Joel Waldfogel, I've kind of highlighted some of the key concepts because it is a complex reading. I just wanted to give you access to some of the more complex readings in a simplified manner, which I provided some key takeaways within the document. So that study revealed that when you look at the introduction of the New York Times in a locally oriented newspaper market, it shifted the market in multiple ways. It encouraged the local newspapers to stop covering national issues. It also encouraged the national papers to not have any local focus on issues because we saw those interested in one collective as we saw the New York Times shift the market as the local paper was not able to compete with the New York Times production of national coverage. Additionally, you saw people with college educated backgrounds gravitating towards reading the New York Times, while those with high school educations tended to gravitate towards the local newspaper. So it created a divide within the newspaper market, and it also encouraged the local newspaper to stop covering national issues and discouraged the national newspaper to cover any local issues. So it creates a division within our media market due to nationalization, which my thesis argues incentivizes the creation and the formation of increased political polarization. So we kind of covered this through the newspaper example that I just mentioned, the institution of the media. Now, one of the primary points in my thesis that I identified that was a bit more confusing and interesting to me when I discovered this is that a lot of the harms that come from the institution of the media in relation to political polarization stem from the nationalization of media sources instead of the bias present within media sources. There have been numerous studies that have illustrated that the degree of division that is incentivized through bias evident in newspapers is more minimal than we may seem. As people this was a study done in the early 2000s, so this study should be replicated in the current media landscape. But they looked at, some of you may know this, but most of you will not, rushlimbaugh.com, and people who visited that site, which was known as a more I don't mean to use the term far right, but it was something that's sat on the right side of the political spectrum when it comes to media sources. But they studied what the viewers of this online platform did with their other time looking at their other time on media platforms. And they noticed that these individuals had a higher percentage chance to look at the opposing left-leaning media sources than moderates. So the access to biased media actually encouraged examination of counter-biased media at a higher rate than an average media viewer. So the harms that come from the current media environment, primarily in regards to polarization, stem from a period of nationalization that has been happening since the 1980s, evident through the Lisa George and Joel Waldfogel study, which is on Eagle Online. Now, this may seem a bit confusing, and I have rambled on for a good bit, but our key takeaways in this slide is that the institution of the media is going through a period of nationalization, evident through the New York Times study available on Eagle Online. And technology is significantly altering the media landscape as it has in the past, as it has with every preceding generation. So the institution of the media is going through a significant period of nationalization over the last said handful of decades. Now, I do want to identify two differences between hard news and soft news. Hard news, think of traditional news items that derive their value from recent relevant events that have some bearing on the lives of readers and viewers. Think about economic, any national news story that has a significant economic impact. Think about international wars that may change the relationship we have with military service within the nation. These are hard news stories that really impact you in your life directly. Think of this may be a hot topic to some. Think of the overturning of Roe v. Wade and Dobbs v. Jackson, reproductive rights, pro-life, pro-choice, whatever you may define it as. That was an example of hard news as it directly impacts a lot of individual citizens' lives. Now, we also look at things like soft news. This stands in contrast, as these are feature stories, often about celebrities, about news items that derive their value not from proximity, timeliness, or relevance, but through interest. Think of a classic example, the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial that was happening. Was that last year or the year before? Time flies fast. But think about that kind of news. Think about the tabloids. Soft news. Think about sports. Think about the fact that I every single day will read some interesting Knicks updates, but that is soft news, not hard news. And it is important to make this distinction. Hard news, traditional news, derive value from recent relevant events that have some bearing and impact on your life. Soft news, feature stories, the tabloids, celebrities, sports, and things that are more entertaining than impactful. And simply ask yourself, is the majority of news you obtain soft or hard news? I know personally, I spend a lot of time looking at the Knicks news, seeing trade rumors. I also like me some movies every now and then. So I will admit to myself, a significant amount of my news stems from soft news. And of course, due to my field of my profession, I have to dive into hard news on a regular basis as well. Now, I want to talk about political parties at large. For one, let's do a little bit of review that term we covered, united and divided governments. Remember, a united government is when the legislative and executive branch, legislative represented through the House and the Senate, and the executive represented through the presidency, are led by a single party within the majority. So currently, prior to this most recent election, we have a divided government. That means the president, Joe Biden, is a Democrat. Our Senate is led by Democrat majority, and our House is led by a Republican majority. We have a divided government. Now, this has nothing to do with their ability to work together. Stop putting that on as your answer on your quizzes. A divided government simply has to do with who is in the majority within the legislative and executive branches. A united government is when one single party leads all of the three branches. Now, we are very likely to see that after this recent election, we will have a united government. Not a government that can compromise and work together perfectly and effectively. I'm not making a claim that they can't, but that is not what the definition united means. United government exclusively focuses on the fact that during the most recent election, Donald Trump won the presidency, a Republican candidate. The Republicans won a majority within the Senate, a Republican Senate, and there is likely to be the maintenance of a Republican House of Representatives. So we see that all three bodies, House, Senate, and the executive branch through the presidency, will be governed in 2025 by one political party, the Republican Party, and it will be a united government. Very important to understand the definition of these terms. I will ask this question on this quiz once again. Now, also, remember the three reasons why we vote the way we do. Remember, it's party loyalties. 80% of voters maintain the same party identification they formed as a young individual, oftentimes in relation to their family, positive or negative. We also see issues involved, valence and spatial issues, a wide range along a single spectrum, minimum wage, valence issues, we all want more of it, honesty of representatives, and low deficit and productive economy, high GDP, all valence issues. And then we finally see something that is evident in simply recent elections and candidate characteristics. Sometimes you will have a candidate that is so unique in the national stage that they create a mass amount of support on that basis alone. So we also want to remember that when it comes to political parties, one of the powers that we allocate to our political parties is the ability to run the primary process. They have the independence when it comes to running the primary elections. Minor regulations in recent years, not necessarily immediately recent years, but we've seen through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we have restrictions into what practices political parties can maintain during the primary process. And it is also important that political parties have a responsibility to maintain state and level party structures. We see this through Democratic and Republican Party conventions at every state level that eventually transpires into being a national party convention for Democrats and Republicans, in which not just do they determine a presidential candidate in the national party conventions, they also determine what delegates will represent each state, and they additionally debate policy positions for their party platforms within the state that will eventually make it to their national level, which acts as a guiding principle for any elected candidate. And we also see that within our political parties, just like within our media institutions, some studies have revealed a period of nationalization as we have focused more so on the national arena instead of local arenas of political engagement. So political parties at large, a lot of review here. United and divided governments. 3 reasons why we vote the way we do. Who is in charge of the political primary process? And what is the relationship currently, this is the only new point in this slide, between state and federal political parties? It is that they are going through a period of nationalization, and we have a significant degree of work starting from the state level and transpiring to the national level, evident through conventions that have been held within the states and then eventually within the federal government. But very important to understand that there is mainly important to remember the primary review points, the 3 on the bottom of this slide. All right, so let's talk about one of the other fascinating institutions, interest groups. Interest groups often get politicized in specific ways as we see them as lobbyists and the individuals who advocate for certain policy positions that we support and do not support quite often. Before we dive into this, I want to cover some key terms. For one, we've talked about the free rider problem in relation to political movements. But we also have to understand that it is someone who is sympathetic to the objectives of an interest group and enjoys the benefits produced without making a contribution. So this is evident with social movements in addition to interest groups. Say you are an individual, say you are a gun owner, and there is certain regulation regarding the weapon that you own in your home, high capacity assault rifle magazines, or whatever it may be. There is new legislation that has been debated, but it was struck down due to progress within social movements advocating for the position that you maintain within this issue. But you were too busy to go out and protest or write to representatives or engage in any form of action regarding this issue. You represent the free rider and the free rider problem at large. There will always be a degree of the free rider problem within every single interest group and every single political movement, as you will have many that benefit from progress or contributions without making their own significant contributions. We also want to see zero-sum policy. There's some policy debate in which any victory by one side comes at the expense of the opposing side, resulting in a lack of compromise. We see this represented by contrasting interest groups quite often. It's two interest groups that advocate for contrasting position. You see some interest groups that advocate for expansion of gun ownership, and you see some that advocate for the restriction of gun ownership. The existence of these two interest groups and their debating often results in zero-sum policy, and it's simply just important to remember that definition. Now, also important to understand that interest groups have a wide range of focuses. We see ideological, economic, special interest, professional. We see interest groups that focus on corporate benefit, focus on individual benefits. We see interest groups that are so specific that there is one called MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. These interest groups, there are hundreds of them within our federal government, and they focus on advocating for the policy positions that relate to their specific focus. And the primary goal, simply put, is to represent the interests of specific groups and corporations to representatives, convey the policy positions that the representatives may not have access to without direct intervention with interest groups. So important to remember the definition of the free rider movement, important to remember the diversity in which interest groups can be focused. I may ask you a question regarding to the different types of interest groups that exist. Primarily, the takeaway is that there is a vast, expansive network of interest groups that exist within the federal government, and they lobby quite heavily. And without this interest group intervention, without lobbying, we would not have the interests of various collectives easily accessible for representatives within our federal government. So let's talk about those lobbyists. So lobbying, really simply, it's an attempt to influence the content of policy by exerting influence on government officials, advocating for certain policy positions that your interest group may advocate for. You can, as a lobbyist, as an interest group, contribute to the funding of a certain candidate's campaign, knowing that they will advocate for the implementation of your policy positions. We also want to understand what a trade association is. These are groups that advance the concerns of specific business interests, such as banks, energy companies, real estate firms, car manufacturers, and much more. Trade associations also have a significant role within our federal government within lobbying activities, advocating for the interests of their collective to representatives who may and most likely have not had access to that concept prior. We also see a definition. We have addressed ad nauseum pluralism. Government responds to individuals through their membership in groups, assuring that government is responsive to a wide range of concerns. So pluralism, we can define it in such a wide array of ways, and I really encourage you to explain it in your own words. The vying for power among multiple groups within a single system, the coexistence of multiple interest groups and ideologies within a single system, the government's attempt to respond to individual concerns through their membership within groups, the various groups within a community, and the existence that there is a diversity of groups. All these are ways to explain what pluralism is as a concept, and it is important to remember and be able to define pluralism when asked to simply define pluralism. So this is where I ramble on about my thesis a bit. I will not ask you anything on the quiz regarding this slide. So please understand that, but please find this fascinating because I spent 2 years trying to research this. And I'll be somewhat quick, and if you want to learn more about this in relation to your paper, I am happy to rant over Zoom, send a detailed email response. So please reach out if you want more of an explanation. This will be a very surface level overview. So what did I do with my thesis? I examined political polarization, most specifically affective polarization, the degree in which citizens maintain negative feelings towards opposing political ideologies, groups, policy preferences, and those on the opposite side of the political spectrum. So we see, and that's simply phrased, is your personal tendency to divide within politics, your personal tendency to view your neighbor negatively due to their political affiliations. So I examined this specific dimension of polarization, affective polarization. And most importantly, I looked at what incentivizes us to divide on such an intimate level as we do today. As we know personally, our levels of polarization impacted our family relationships, our neighbor relationships, our work environments at times. And why? Well, my thesis examined meso-institutions. Think of these as kind of the title of this lecture, the intermediaries, the institutions that you have to interact with in order to access your government. You have to interact with the media. You have to interact with interest groups and political parties in order to productively interact with your government. So these are the institutions that act as stopping points when it comes to your ability to, or maybe pausing points or points to build when it comes to your ability to advocate for your position within the federal government or state governments. So meso-institutions, some examples consist of the media, interest groups, political parties, and the meso-institution that I embedded into the discussion in my thesis was the meso-institution of markets. So my claim, and building off of, I'm trying to think of the exact author, Paul Pearson and Eric Schickler, some great political scientists, nationally renowned political scientists at large, who made the first argument about meso-institutions that they are furthering the divide among the general population, furthering affective polarization as they used to be regulatory. A meso-institution like the media would encourage you to have access to counter perspectives and localize yourself, embed yourself within your local political environment, and mitigate the level of polarization. Recent years with technological shifts has incentivized these institutions to be more divisive. Instead of regulating you, they reinforce already present levels of polarization, making them more intense. You can see this through the media as people tend to gravitate towards their preferred media networks and utilize the media in a very divisive manner in recent years without diving into detail on that. But I will also point out that a lot of the division stemming within the media stems from the nationalization of media platforms. I want to again emphasize, none of this will be on the quiz, but none of this slide will be on the quiz. But to continue building on, interest groups in the past historically were self-regulating as they conveyed the interests of specific collectives to all representatives on both sides of the political aisle. And in recent years, their actions have shifted away from advocating as much for policy initiatives and instead advocating for certain candidates and campaigns to be elected who they know will advocate for their policy initiatives. So they stopped reaching out to the opposite side of the political aisle and have more preemptive strategic planning when it comes to intervention within government. We also see political parties, as I mentioned before, a period of nationalization as they are focused more heavily on the federal level of the political party than on the state levels. Very evident in the state of Montana, especially if you identify with the Democratic Party, as there's not much momentum within that collective in the state, just as if you were in California as a Republican. We also see my thesis claim that markets, where you go to shop every day, used to actually incentivize a lower level of polarization through mundane and indirect interaction with representatives of opposing political parties. But we saw in recent years, a lot of my argument anecdotally focuses on some of the dimensions of our lives that have been politicized. Think about a few years ago what happened with Bud Light and how they were politicized. If you know what I'm talking about, you know exactly why I mentioned that. If you don't, and you can just move on and not look into that or look into it. It was an ad campaign they put out and resulted in a boycott from a certain collective of individuals within the nation. So these market environments can encourage or discourage you to interact with people of opposing political viewpoints. And the less these institutions, these meso-institutions, the media, interest groups, identity groups, and the market encourages us to interact with people who disagree with us, the less likely we will be to have positive views of those individuals. And we will instead have contact with counter perspectives that is more negative than it is beneficial. So my thesis claimed that the nationalization present within meso-institutions shifted the way these institutions operate as intermediaries for people in their government to encourage more division through reinforcing already present levels of division, where in the past they regulated these levels of division, not abolishing them, but mitigating them through ideal contact theory. So when excessively simplified and summarized, that is my thesis. And if you're writing about political polarization, which a lot of you are, I would be more than happy to talk to you about some of the sources I referenced when I wrote this thesis and some of the dimensions of my argument. You do not have to adapt them, as it can be a bit more complicated than the frame in which you are writing your paper, but it could benefit your paper if we had a Zoom one-on-one meeting discussing these issues. So what did we learn, y'all? What is framing? What is the primary goal of interest groups? What is the supremacy clause? Also cover the Ninth Amendment primarily. What are the two definitions of nationalization? Social and economic, industry-based, where it's, the state taking over an industry that was privately owned. That's the industry-based definition of nationalization, or the social definition, our tendency to focus on national news instead of local news. And define pluralism again. All right, there are your answers. This is the scope of the lecture. When it comes to studying for the quiz, study this and the Ninth Amendment, and that should be all you need to focus on in addition to last week's content. You should be able to do great on this upcoming quiz, a shorter quiz when it comes to the content covered. Now, what's due this week? We are done with our assignments. We only have to do one more quiz, and that is due at the end of this week. That will be accessible Monday. And please, just make sure you study this week's lecture and last week's lecture before you take the quiz. Your lowest quiz grade will get dropped. But also every quiz we've taken in this class will be also implemented on the final. So make sure you understand the content. Even if you have 3 100s, don't just fail this one. Make sure you understand it because it will be relevant when it comes to the final. It will be a quarter of your final. So we have this. We have our final discussion that we're starting next week. We're starting the last one. So it's important to get that done. Significant part of your grade. Make sure you're contributing 4 posts, 3 in 1 week, and then 1 in the following week. I have covered it too many times to where I believe anybody listening to this lecture has already heard me, and those who are having issues are probably not listening to this lecture. It's also important to look at your readings and watch the lecture as you already have done if you're hearing me right now. Hint, hint, a dimension of your participation grade in this class will rely on your accessing of the readings. I will be choosing 5 readings at large at random in this class, and if you have not accessed them at all, which I can see when you have accessed them, and if you have not accessed them or only accessed them this week, that will result in a minor point deduction. So make sure you are looking at your readings, especially those relating to assignments. So thank you guys. As always, speaking honestly, I really wish we were in person. I wish we had a Zoom call where we were all together, because it's the beauty that comes when we debate these issues, when we talk out loud, when we passionately talk together. It creates so much more excitement among this environment. I appreciate you all immensely for listening to me as I've yelled at you about this content throughout this week, throughout this semester. I think a lot of the assignments we have done have been very beneficial, and I hope they've helped you understand some of these concepts further, helped you work on how to convey your message, how to provide your definition when you talk about these important and divisive concepts at times, and do it in a way that enables you to understand someone else's definition. I really personally believe what we can gain out of this class can make us better citizens, better people, and better to the people in our lives, and really can expand our opportunities, as this gives us the skills to put partisanship to the side and simply align with individuals because we're on the same journey. So I really appreciate your willingness to listen to me rant and ramble on in these lectures, and it means the world. I will make sure that I am available to any one of you immediately if you need help this semester. Do not email me a day or two before the final essay is due saying, can you read over this? No, that's too close to the deadline. If you can reach out to me 4 days prior to something is due and ask for help, I will immediately get on Zoom with you. I will work with you hand in hand and do everything in my power to make sure you succeed. I will give you my all, but you have to give me at least a little bit of a window, because there are about 100 of you that I'm trying to work with, and it's hard to work with 100 students in a 1-day notice. So I am here to help you however I can. I really appreciate your willingness to listen to me in these lectures, and I had a great time in this semester. I hope you did too. I hope you benefited from some of this work, and let's keep working together. Let's end this strong.